All right. I think we have a lot of people in attendance and we have several people online virtually as well. So let's go ahead and kick off this Citywide Advisory Committee meeting. This is August 25th and we'd like to welcome you. We wanted to go over a little bit about the module 1 and 2 outreach as we went back and revised it. Talk a little bit about what we heard as a team, and then really, what have you heard? Have you heard from others outside of those events? Did you hear about the events? Because we'd like to start thinking about how we can best prepare for our module 3 outreach, which will be happening in October. So it'll be really important for that. Then we also want to chat with you a little bit about how you best think we can approach module 3 in the efforts to achieve our goals of including everybody in the process appropriately, really getting great products at the end that support our city goals. And then, of course, getting those desired results that we're looking for as a city. So we're going to have a big effort today. And so let's go ahead and get kicked off. Lindsay, do you want to kick it off with what we heard from module 1 and 2 outreach, and then hear from everybody as to what they heard?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. As just a few reminders to please speak into the microphone when you guys are here so that people online can hear us more clearly. As a reminder, this is Lindsay from the Office of Community Engagement. So I saw lots of your faces out this summer at our last round of outreach. We did 3 of our open houses, and then we also did a digital open house. We had about 170 folks between the 3 events, pretty much a packed house at all of them, which was great to see. Very engaged, overall pretty positive. I want to hear what you guys hear first before we kind of give our overall just top themes that we kind of heard. And then several email comments from you as well as other members of the community as well that our staff has been reviewing and discussing throughout these last couple of weeks since we last saw you. So I'm going to open it up to you guys for anything that you guys kind of heard, overall themes and topics before we kind of give our general thoughts so far.
There we go. This is Roberta. I heard very positive things about the community meetings. I went to 2 out of 3. I think people liked the format. I personally liked it because you did an overview and then allowed a lot more one-to-one conversation. And I also liked the panels that you had up because those were very easy to understand. What I observed there, and also in talking to some of my neighbors and such, is, there still remains concern about parking and density, and it depends on how you approach it. A lot of my cohorts are concerned about right, wrong, or indifferent, the perception that we've lessened the density because these are people with younger children. Anybody's younger to me at this point, but people in their 20s and 30s, who may not have the financial resources. And that's just one group because there's folks with financial challenges at all levels. Parking is a concern. I'm very involved with climate advocacy. And so, I recognize that transportation is something that we don't deal with, but the feedback I've gotten personally by allowing more parking, and it just depends on where you are, it's not going to encourage doing alternate forms of transportation like biking. So I think that's it for the moment for me. Thanks.
Go for it, Byron.
Well, I don't have anything. This is Byron. I don't have anything constructive to say necessarily. I'll just answer the question. After a couple of the outreach efforts, I did hear from people talking about parking. There were some density anxiety, I think, with some of the neighbors, especially in the northwest part of town. and some not concerns, but a lot of questions about how module 3 will roll into module 1 and 2. So that's about it.
A question follow up to that. The Northwest concerns you mentioned related to density. What's the nature of those?
I think there remains, at least the folks that I've been speaking with, there remains some anxiety about not knowing what neighborhood density looks like. I think we've seen some examples of what that can look like. I've produced some examples myself, but I think a lot of people just have in their minds apartment buildings or very dense residential structures. Dense residential structures towering over their homes, that kind of anxiety. So the stuff that you would expect, I think.
This is Ian. I can kind of echo what Byron was saying. I went to one of the Q&A sessions at the library. There was, I think, some question about density in R1 zones. Nobody was outright opposed to it. I think they were just more interested in what that meant. What I think going further to explain what a duplex looks like, what it can look like, instead of imagining this giant apartment complex. One of the other comments I heard was, how do you manage affordability? I think that's a complicated question for sure, but overall, I feel like the reception from the community was pretty good though. So good job.
Anyone else or anyone online? Looks like Esther has her hand raised. Go for it, Esther.
Hello. So I attended 2 of the meetings the city held, and there was great turnout, and there was something that I hadn't seen necessarily from the previous meetings, and that was a real diverse attendance from like generational, in terms of younger folks attending. I saw a lot of younger folks attending the meeting at the library, and then the meeting out at Quail Ridge tended to be folks a little older. And I too heard, not just there, but I have heard in talking to folks in the neighborhood, parking, density is another concern. And I guess I understand the concern, but I also have to remember that not everyone is going to be excited about any change that the city proposes. We have to come to a middle ground.
Great. Thanks, Esther. Anyone else online or in person? Go for it, Brad.
This is Brad. Some of the things I'd heard were concerns about, of course, the density and the parking, and even density deep within residents might create too much traffic past residency, or, then there's the argument that, density on the corridors is going to be ugly to drive by. So like Esther's saying, there's going to have to be some give and take there. It's reality. I was at a local event where Tim had come and talked, and I hate being the devil's advocate there, but he really made some sense on what he was saying, and he was speaking reality, and that's what everybody really needs to hear. But some of the concerns I was hearing were that maybe the neighborhood associations were being drowned out because they're the voice, and that maybe there was an attack on ownership, it's being discouraged anymore. So that's just what I heard. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Brad. Anybody else online or Roberta? There's no hand raised online right now, so go for it.
I just have a question for either Brad or Tim. Since I wasn't at the meeting, you mentioned what was the reality that was being spoken about? So I know, because we all have different realities. I travel on my own.
Well, Brad, I'll start maybe. I just think, it was probably an hour and a half or so discussion. So we talked about kind of everything that's within the ordinance. So I don't think it was one thing. It was just all the issues around, a city that's changing and the kinds of things that we have to share responsibility for as a community when it comes to that. And so it wasn't one thing really. It was just all that is a part of this. Is that fair?
Yeah. It's hard to pick out one particular thing for sure. But, just like all the movement to the south and how you guys are really putting in the effort to, slow that down, keep the open spaces, and the reality that there's people here and we have to accommodate them. I'm not for just building anywhere just to accommodate, but, the reality is people are coming here and you guys are trying to maintain the way of life here, which is going to be difficult to do. And that is a reality.
Just wanted to thank Brad and Tim, because to play on something Esther, I think it was her who said is sometimes I don't know how we're going to reach that middle ground. And so that gives me a little bit more hope, Brad. So thanks. It gives me a little bit more hope because sometimes, this is a pretty long process and everyone's concerned about where we're going to wind up.
Exactly. I actually got, I was actually encouraged by, what Tim was saying. I also, I'm this community. I'm the community. I mean, I'm not nuts and bolts, code. So as a community, it's encouraging to hear that you're working both sides and you're really trying to make an effort to keep this way of life.
This is Drew. Just to reiterate, one of the points that's been made is I've been hearing how valuable it would be to have some graphics and illustrations of these examples, especially as it relates to the incentive programs. Running a couple scenarios in the code showing how that could be visually represented. So I don't know if that's part of the plan as we're working on module 3, but each zone has kind of that one example, but maybe expanding that.
Any other comments or questions? Yep, go for it, Brad.
Get me going. As far as the community involvement here, I got to say, I haven't heard anything about it. Like I said, I'm probably the community, hearing that there's 170 people at a meeting. Well, that's a small representation of Boise, but I understand that that's probably a lot of people for one of these gatherings, but I didn't really hear anything about it. I actually looked today from looking through the agenda that we were going to talk about that. And I went back and looked at emails to see if, you guys had mentioned that this was happening. And I don't get on the Boise website, and I'm sure 99% of this town doesn't either. So we need to make a bigger effort. If we really want comments from the community, we need to make a bigger effort in some form, whether it's the news or flyers or, whatever, to get this community involvement.
We'll come back to that for ideas for the next round. Thanks, Brad. Yeah, Marissa.
This is Marissa. Yeah, I would probably echo what Brad said. Just from talking to people out in Southwest, there didn't seem to be as much awareness of these meetings as there was the first time around. And that might be because of the time of year. I mean, these summer, the other ones were held. I don't even remember when they were so long ago. And perhaps people are also a little bit confused. This is a second rendition. And they think that they've already heard it all and don't realize that. But I think, sometimes where you have the meetings, the one that was at West Junior High was definitely closer to home for most of Southwest Boise. And even though the library at Hillcrest is our closest Boise library, it's a long ways. And so that may have been an issue for some people too. But overall, I haven't really heard a lot of chatter about the new rezone. I don't know if that's positive, like people are liking it, or if they just don't know about it.
We have Francis and Patrick with their hands up. Francis, would you like to go first, followed by Patrick?
Sure, thank you. I thought that the meeting that I attended was very well presented, and I really appreciated your visuals that you had around the room, plus the ability for participants to go afterwards and have a one-on-one conversation with city representatives. I thought that was a really great design. And I'm wondering, perhaps you're going to talk about this, but I'm wondering whether you had contact with the neighborhood association presidents after the module 2 was revamped, and whether perhaps that's why we haven't been hearing a lot from those associations. And assuming if that were the case, then maybe they were satisfied that they were listened to, because I personally thought that you did a great job of incorporating feedback.
Thanks, Francis. And I'll just give a quick reply. Yes, I was not present for the meeting, but the rest of the team was, that did a virtual meeting with the neighborhood association leadership. So if Tim or anybody else wants to chime in on that conversation, but that was after the 3 open houses had taken place. So maybe just a couple weeks ago.
Yep, we followed up and it was over the lunch hour. So we had an opportunity, and I think it was about 13 groups, I believe, that were represented.
And just for kind of a refresh too, we have an Energize Our Neighborhoods program manager in our office, Tiffany, and she handles all the communication directly with the neighborhood association. So it's funneled from me to her through the neighborhood association. So she's emailing them, as I'm sure a lot of you know, on a consistent basis. But yeah, that's all kind of done through the Energize program.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yep, thanks, Francis. Patrick, and then looks like Kelly has her hand raised too.
For the discussion about different alternative ways to obtain more public feedback, I want to speak up for the methodology of randomized high quality surveying, which minimizes response bias and also minimizes the time and effort commitment of the people whose opinion you want. So, random address numbers or whatever methodology is preferred at the detail level. Random sampling with a survey gives, in my view, statistically more representative results than people that will show up to a 2-hour meeting, et cetera. And that should be given appropriate weight. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. And I will also mention that Kyle Patterson, who's in our Office of Strategic Initiatives, had an intern named Tara that has a background in studying ethnography and anthropology. And she went and did some targeted outreach for us. And this will be in the report. She hasn't given us her full report yet. She pretty much went and spent all of her time at laundromats, surveying cost burden renters and their thought process and their thoughts on the zoning code. Very different perspectives than what we hear in public meetings, which is what we want. She spent over 30 hours, took a translator with her a couple times. So that's kind of Patrick's point of public meetings is of course a part of the process that we'll always go through as city government. And then also some of that other targeted outreach to hear from people that might not have the resources or the time or availability or childcare that can come to some of those public meetings. So that'll be in the full outreach report, her findings as well. So just a little tidbit that we did as well. Okay, Kelly, I think you're next.
Hi, yeah, so I wanted to address a little bit more the question and add some comments about the neighborhood association meeting. So I don't know who is involved with neighborhood associations, but there is a monthly call that we have amongst the leadership, a collaborative visioning call that Tim and Tiffany from Energize Boise and the rest of the staff was kind enough to attend. And most neighborhood associations have identified an individual on their boards to be a contact, a liaison, to be plugged in and follow up with what's happening with this zoning rewrite and provide feedback and so forth. So the forum was for the leadership and those folks in particular to provide feedback and also ask very specific questions after their contacts or leaders were able to attend a city meeting. So and I think that overall it was a really robust conversation. But yeah, the neighborhood associations were well represented in that, and then we would like to do that again on a quarterly basis, and especially as we get into module 3.
Go ahead, Roberta.
I know Kelly is very involved. This is Roberta. Kelly, I know you're very involved with your neighborhood association. And this question is likely not directed for you, but just general. Do you reach out to your citizens in your neighborhood association? And is there, this might be more of a Tiffany question, because I don't know, and I attend a number of my neighborhood associations, and there has not been a lot of feedback to me as a citizen. That's the best way to put it.
So do you want me to reply? This is Kelly. Is it okay if I reply to that?
That would be great. From my
okay. Yeah. So you kind of just threw it out there. So, I mean, you know, in our neighborhood association, and I also know in the West End neighborhood association, it is a topic that's part of our regular meetings that we have, as well as gatherings. And the reason why I mentioned the West End is because we've been working closely together, and then we also have shared events together. Like, for example, at the concert in the park that we had at Fairview Park, you know, that was something that we were answering questions about, and I know that there was dialogue about it. As far as like, you know, and as sharing out on our Facebook page and our neighborhood association page, you know, that updates and asking for feedback on the surveys and that sort of thing. That's the type of communication that I know our neighborhood association has. And I think that several of the associations are doing something fairly similar. I've seen something, you know, the North End of Neighborhood Association, Nina's done that sort of thing as well, but nothing more formal than that.
And I best clarify that I do appreciate my neighborhood association because it is a volunteer group. But, and again, this is Roberta, back to some of the communication topics, and I hope we can continue that, is it's a big responsibility for a neighborhood association when they have a lot of things on their plate. And, you know, when the others were speaking, what typically happens is unless this really impacts them, like a lot of my neighbors are not impacted by the zoning unless their children are trying to buy into Boise or rent in Boise. So, you know, how we discuss future engagement is how do we make it important to them? And I think the value of what the city is a big topic. So thanks.
This is Marissa. I'm the president of the Southwest Ada County Alliance Neighborhood Association. And I would say we're fairly good about on social media, posting things, sharing things from the city, just saying, hey, this is happening. I don't usually want people's comments to come back to me because then whether it's zoning or developments or anything, because then I feel responsible to send those in to the person they need to go to. So I always tell people, this is who you need to send that to, not to your neighborhood association. So I don't get a lot of feedback other than like when I see people out at neighborhood meetings or something talking to them. And we do have a newsletter that goes out sporadically when I have time to write it. You know, we've had it on our agenda I think every time we meet monthly. So we have it on our agenda to talk about at a board meeting. But our board meetings, it depends on what's going on in the neighborhood. Like sometimes it's just the board there. Sometimes there's 15 people there. Sometimes there's more. It depends on what's controversial and what's happening. So it can be, I think, relying on the neighborhood association to let the public know is not probably best practice.
Thanks, Marcia.
Esther, it looks like you have your hand up as well.
Yes. So this is Esther, and I would agree with Marissa. So on the fact that relying on the neighborhood association to get the word out as should not be used as best practice. It is just one of a handful of tools that the city should use to engage community members. I sit on the Collister Neighborhood Association board and have off and on since 2004. And we do, and throughout this time, we have sent out emails letting folks know about their opportunity to comment, and at all times about their opportunity to keep up to date. And we direct them to the city's rezone page. But our listserv is not a true representation. It doesn't include all of our residents. So one of the things that we recently decided to do, which I don't think is, I'm not aware at the moment of any other neighborhood that association that's done this, but we have essentially divided our very large neighborhood into smaller sections. And then we're doing targeted outreach activities and bringing folks in or inviting folks in for an evening meeting where we as a board are listening to any concerns that they have. And we're steering away from directing the conversation. It is more of a listening session. And I will tell you that even at that, we've had two so far. One where we sent out, at least 500 postcards and we had 12 people show up. And the second one about maybe it was, I don't know, it's less than 1,000 postcards that were sent to every household, and we had 9 folks. So, I mean, we're super excited about getting folks to the table, but while we can get the word out, we have not managed to reach even 50% of our neighborhood.
Thanks, Esther.
And Ben Zamzow has a chat item out there. It says, asking if he's curious if the city has received much input from the mixed use zones from our outreach. We have heard quite a bit about mixed use. People seem to be very excited to have opportunities for retail, dining, office near their homes. People seem to be very excited about walkability, being able to ride their bike and having somewhere nearby that they don't have to get into the car and traverse across the city to get to those destinations. So we've heard really positive things in regard to that. I think the one thing that I have heard come up time and time again is when we are talking about some of those mixed use zones, if we have those along the corridors, how will they transition into those neighborhoods? And which is an extremely reasonable response. So we have been directing them to look at those neighborhood transition standards to make sure that they feel that those are right. We've also explained that R2 buffer that we would include adjacent to the M3 zones so that we can have a natural transition in height as well. So those are some of the items that I've heard. I don't know if others would like to elaborate or talk about what they've heard in that regard.
Andrea, I would also add, and this was part of our conversation, I believe, last month. We heard some comments of for the MX3 zones, do we want to expand those? we heard a lot of good feedback about directing the development where we have investment, and then everyone coming up with, well, we've invested here. So just some more comments on that specifically about MX3.
That's great. Thank you all for your feedback. And again, we'll get into module 3 and outreach at the end of this as well. So ideas and thoughts, we'll get to at the end. Yeah, just to kind of reiterate a couple of the comments that Andrea and Deanna said. Overall, pretty positive. The tone was definitely different in these last couple of meetings than our last round of outreach, which was nice to hear. As we've gone back out to the community, the MX3 people were excited about, the MX2, making sure that was continuing to be pedestrian friendly. A couple disappointments in the reemergence of R1A. Again, lots of great comments. We'll do the full outreach report that will be available for your guys' next meeting. But that takes, a compilation of written comments, in-person comments, online comments that we've received from everyone. So I appreciate all your input. I know a lot of you have sent us lengthy emails with a lot of great comments as well. So we appreciate that. I'll kick it over to our next line item.
I think we're going to share the screen in just a second. But this is more conversation. So I'll start this, but I think anyone from our team can go. So as a reminder, when we did the module 1 and 2 revisions, we really wanted to focus on some high level goals and then being able to adjust the zoning code according to those goals, so that when we made a change to the code, we were able to say, does this help move this goal forward? So having a variety of neighborhoods, does the change that we're proposing help strengthen that? Does the zoning code districts help direct development where we have planned public investment and so on? So just to center us on the city that we're creating, these were our goals, and really touched on module 1 and module 2, which are the zone districts and development standards. As we all know, we're moving now into module 3, which is process. And we wanted to kind of take a similar approach, thinking about when we think about our process, what are the goals that we want to move forward with that process? And really our conversation today is, are these our goals? So will our process, and so these are some of the ones that we've brainstormed, but we want to hear your reactions to them. Are we missing any? Are there more to add when we're thinking about our process? So our process will reinforce our desired outcomes, right? We want something as you get planning and zoning approval to help achieve what we set out to achieve in modules 1 and 2, right? We want a process that helps us have a variety of neighborhoods, that helps us direct development where there's investment, that gives us sustainable and affordable housing now, as well as manages growth at the edge of the city. So if we have something in our process that's doing the opposite of that, we want to revise it or reimagine it. As well as we want to have an approval process that results in excellent projects. I think everyone in the city of Boise wants to see good things built and bad things not built. And so how can we set up a process that will result in that? As well, we've heard a lot from our community that they want to be involved to make sure those projects meet those desired outcomes. So how can we do it in a way that's meaningful in the process? So these are just some of them. And really, I think that the next 45 minutes or so is, let's talk about them. Maybe if we want to focus on the first one, the second one, if anything jumps out, it's really, we want to hear from you because we're still drafting module 3. And if anyone else on our team wants to add to that explanation, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, I don't know that I have much to add to it, Deanna. This is Lena, but I guess just kind of explaining, sort of our process behind coming up with this very much a draft conceptual framework. Obviously these are very broad statements, right? I mean, have an approval process that results in excellent projects. You can fit a lot into that statement. But the intention is not to be so vague that it doesn't mean anything. It's intended to be a guidance for when we look at the concrete changes that we might make to our process. These are things that we can sort of test them against and ask ourselves if we're really
guiding ourselves directly on the same path that we have been previously. So trying to keep ourselves consistent, even as we open things up for lots of discussion and lots of possibility for change and shift. And then I think just on the last one too, that, thinking about community involvement and all the different ways that can be supported and all the different feedback that we hear from it. So, one of the things we hear from folks is a desire for just making our tools easier, right? A code is a very difficult document. It's legal and heavy on a lot of language that might not be familiar to people. So sometimes we can't always simplify things as much as we would like to within the code itself, but what kinds of tools might we come up with that will help to get that clarification out into the community and how people use it?
So as we move on and start to draft module 3, what are some of the things that you think should be at the top of really brought to the forefront for us to really think about? Anything come to mind right off the bat?
One thing I think I might have brought up in the past meeting was we were talking about activity corridors. And so one of the goals that I see here, direct development, where there's planned public investment, is there a way to also direct development towards, private investment, whether that's, apartments or places that are being developed? I don't know, just throwing it out there. So I think we were talking about it in like the past meeting in regards to like the activity corridors. So we're identifying, these are the transit lines, right? These are the places where the public has invested money. So we want these to be our activity centers. I think there are also places that developers have decided that this is a corridor that we want to, increase density on, put money into. And so I'm starting to identify those areas as well, because eventually they're going to get to that point where it's going to be public investment.
You're saying broaden, perhaps we need to think about broadening the definition or the areas upon which we think there's planned public investment.
Exactly.
Because it can be planned from comprehensive
maybe,
planning department, or it can be planned from folks getting construction loans.
Exactly. And maybe I'm thinking of it too narrowly. Maybe everybody else is thinking of it more broadly, but I mean, that's a good question.
I think it's a good question for you all. When you say planned public investment, I think maybe what does that mean is maybe the question.
Sure.
What corridor are you thinking of that we're not including?
So I don't have any off the top of my head. I did talk to one, he's an architect as well, and he had mentioned the Overland Corridor, which I think came up in the past meeting. But I don't have any probably off the top of my head that meet that. So
what's the process to evaluate zoning on certain corridors?
Yeah.
I don't know if this would be in module 3 necessarily, that would be a part of the code.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Oh.
This is Jessica. I was just noting that there's process in the code in module 3 of like, what's our process for plan review and approvals and appeals and noticing but there's also these other processes that we create as far as how the department works and what's the sequence of events that happen to amend the code or to assess like what else are we missing that we need to do. So are there guidelines, are there policies? It's kind of like a different process outside of the process of module 3. But we have heard that in the module 1 and module 2 outreach of like the logic behind the mixed use zones and density where investment's been made. But what you're getting at is like when more investment is made, whether it's public or private, what's the relationship then of how you evaluate that for any zoning changes? I think perhaps.
And this is Deanna. I think so one of, and module 3 is a lot of like nitty gritty legal process. So how do you, like Jessica said, appeals and whatnot. But one of the things we could think about is in a rezone, there'll be findings or legal findings to rezone a property to something. And that could be reevaluating. I can't even remember off the top of my head what rezone findings are, but is there something that opens that door for, as new investment comes in, it justifies a rezone or not? That could be something to your effect.
Unrelated, this is Shellen. And I don't know, I think module 3 is the place for the discussion, and I'll just say it really frankly, because I don't know how else to say it. But if I keep, we are always talking about affordability and folks wanting affordable housing through the zoning code, through our policies. And like, I would say that, zoning is like one of many, many, many ways that to help create affordability. And it is certainly not the only and cannot be the only. But one of the most critical things within zoning to create affordability is to allow what you want to be administratively approved. Period.
I have a comment. I think it's a good segue from that. On the slide, I think this is Drew. Sorry. I think the challenge I see, it's an exciting challenge, is creating a community consensus on what an excellent project is. That's a hard lift, right? And affordability might be one of those things, but to the extent that this code can help this community agree upon what an excellent project means, I think then the third bullet and the approval process are benefited from that. If the community can say, this checks 3 out of 5 boxes or whatever it might be, your path forward is X. And I think that's where module 3 can really step in and help. But I think you have to answer that really hard question first.
And we'll talk a little bit more about outreach, but I am not like, I don't lead by consensus. It's like I don't do that. It's not my forte. It's not my strength. So I struggle with it because I think that everybody needs to have a voice, and then you need to make a decision. And the decision is not everybody is going to speak, right? So we've talked about this, but that idea of a community creating an excellent project, or creating, the checklist of things, awesome idea. Do it for a little while and then let leadership figure it out, or let the people that we pay a bunch of money figure it out. Because, we have a really great staff, we have a really great consultant on board, and they've told us, at least the consultant has told us time and time again, we've done more outreach than almost any of the other communities they've worked in. Great, Boise deserves it, awesome. But like, you got to cut it and go. And so that excellent project, give the community time to make a checklist, and then you guys figure it out. You guys, help us. We're not professionals, all of us here. So I would, I kind of defer to people that like have been educated in the world of this stuff, because I didn't choose to do that.
I think that that's a really interesting conversation. And earlier we heard, hey, there's questions on how do module 3, how is that going to tie in with module 1 and 2? And this is a perfect example of that is, we want to create these objective checklists to make sure that we're getting the desired results that we're looking for. And so you're going to see a lot of those in your use specific standards. You're going to see those come about in your setbacks and your building height and all of those design standards that we've spent so much time working on. And then we decide, okay, is that checklist sufficient? And is it good enough that we know that the community is going to be supportive of that and we're achieving our goals, that something should be then administrative? Or what is the threshold for something to divert and to take a different path where the additional input might be needed. And our local land use planning act, that's going to describe, in certain cases where we do have to have public hearings. And so that's going to be your conditional use permits, your annexations, your rezones, your PUDs, those things, those have to go to a public hearing. And that certainly is not optional, but those other things, making sure that we've got that checklist so it's right and we're really getting good quality products that are lending itself to everything the city's trying to do. So whether it's tying into our sustainability goals, our water sustainability, our whatever we're looking for, that we have the ability to achieve it through that checklist. So this is really good.
So I'll give you an example of a community. Lord. Okay, excuse me. This is an example of a community that I work in that has a checklist of what a ministerial process entails. And it's a different community. So the items in the checklist don't really matter, right? I would say, we create our own checklist, but developer looks at that checklist and says, and it's only for residential, and it has a threshold of unit count. And it says, if I'm building under X amount of units, I will be ministerial if I meet these 10 things. If I want a variance, which I know is not a word we can use in the state, but if I want to, what do we use? Exception? Do we use exception here? What do we use? Waiver. Well, you know what I mean. If we want one of those things, then we go to a director's hearing. And so once a week, I think, the directors of, Public Works, all the departments that would normally comment on plans meet, and it's a public hearing, right? So if you want a small variance to the ministerial process, you get to go to a public hearing at the director's level, but those are still minor variances. So yes, people will show up on occasion, but it's not as large or as political as perhaps like a planning and zoning or a city council meeting. And then if you're not meeting the ministerial process, then you go through, your sort of typical P&Z and whatever. But I mean, it's very clear. And I will tell you, the developers look at that and they try to get into that ministerial process. They will do whatever they can do to get that 90 days, period. And so just make a good checklist. And then have an in-between of professionals looking at a project for small variances. And then if a developer doesn't want to do that because, for all sorts of perfectly good reasons, then they go through a different process that's longer and more arduous and has more critique.
Thank you. And we have a chat from Patrick supporting Shellen's comments as well. So and we also have Hillary. Did you want to take the floor?
Sure, the virtual floor. Can you hear me?
You're good to go.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I wanted to dovetail a bit on what Shellen was saying. So a couple of the things that I think we have to bear in mind with process is that some of these bullet points that we have listed will end up with a natural tension between them. So one of the things that I would say that I've heard pretty consistently is, there is a fair amount of skepticism toward, large developers or institutional developers or that type of thing, right? Well, the more onerous your process is, the more likely you are to have those people be the ones to develop your city, because those are the only ones that can afford it, that can lay out the time, the money, that can hire the consultants, that can fight it, that can be in the trenches for it. So if you really do want to see projects done by local and regional and smaller developers, you have to have a process that is transparent, that is fast relatively, and that is affordable and doesn't, require them to go out and hire a bevy of attorneys to go plead their case. The second thing that we've talked about is that we are really wanting consistent outcomes that build trust with the city, and we want transparency in the process. And the more, as I think this is what Shellen was getting to, the more doubt there is in their process, the more time it takes, the more we deviate from what we have in the code, the less trust there will be, which is exactly what got us here in the first place. And the third is that if we really do want to manage growth on the edges of the city, allowing for significant public input at many stages of the process and drawing out that process is going to push greenfields development. And the reason why it pushes greenfields development is because developers will avoid neighborhoods where they think that there is going to be substantial pushback. So not every single one of these things can happen, and we have to prioritize what we want to see. And there's going to be, there's give and take on all of that, right? And it's not, an all or nothing approach, but we're going to have a good checklist, like Shellen said, and a good set of priorities that are in line with the outcomes that we want to see. Not just something that sounds great on paper. It has to produce the right outcome.
This is Marissa. I just had a little comment about the planned public investment or infrastructure. I live in the area of impact. I'm right on city limits. I can put my hand across the fence and I'm in the city. So I look at things through kind of that lens of being away from really good infrastructure. But I think one of the issues that neighbors in Southwest and Northwest have, and other areas of the city that are on the fringes, is that we get little islands of good infrastructure. And so developers may focus on like this intersection here, and it's awesome at that intersection, but everything from that intersection to the city is just like non-existent or just really crappy. And people get angry about that because, they see the city, or I think they feel like the city is just kind of forgetting about them. And it's not just the city, it's like, the highway district. And, we've seen road projects, like my section of Cloverdale was supposed to be improved 5 years ago, and we're not even at design yet. And yet we see projects pushed off, and we've tracked it on staff reports where you can go back 10 years and every single staff report will have a different date for when that road's going to be fixed, when we will have sidewalks. And that, I know that's not the city's problem, that's ACHD's problem, but I think the general public just looks at it as one big thing, and they just blame everybody. They blame everybody in government. So I think if you're going to let, it's not really leapfrog development, but kind of this development that happens on the fringes, I think there has to be some sort of threshold. Like the stuff in between has to meet a certain threshold before we continue to just push out into the area of impact, or even just develop out on the far reaches of the city. Because, like I said, like I have biked in here from the area of impact before. And today I drove halfway in because I didn't want to deal with the stuff that was in between. So just keep that in mind.
Byron.
This is Byron again. I want to talk about something that Hillary was saying earlier. One of the really strong pathways to affordability that we've talked about since this process began was the notion that one of our goals of the code rewrite process was to make it as easily navigated and as egalitarian as possible, something that the average homeowner could navigate on their own, and really trying to take advantage of one of those really strong pathways to affordability in housing, which is where homeowners' wealth building endeavors overlap people's need for housing. And when some of us were fighting so hard for a variety of housing types to be included as allowed uses in module 2 especially, and allowing some of those housing types that we just haven't built in Boise for a long time because they were illegal, making them legal again and providing these pathways forward as allowed uses is really great, because once we get to module 3, we can talk about how allowed uses have this streamlined approval process that make it possible for the average Boisean to navigate the code in that way. So when they're looking at like ways of upgrading their property or activating their property, either so that they can stay put where they are in their neighborhood by providing a small rental like an ADU or dividing their home into a duplex, things like that. These elements of the code that we've been building in this whole time, the adaptive reuse portion of the code that we kind of workshop for a long time, is a good example of that. I'm really excited about the way that we can take what we've done in module 1 and 2 and decide how we can kind of open those pathways in module 3, utilizing this notion of allowed use. All of the housing types that we're going to be putting into the new code as allowed uses that weren't allowed before has tremendous potential, in my opinion.
Kelly, you have your hand raised online.
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to, what Byron just said sort of piggybacked really well into what I wanted to talk about, which is the neighborhood association plans. You know, I think that that's one way that the neighborhood associations can have a very strong voice at the type of development and so forth that we have in our neighborhoods. And I think, you know, our neighborhood association in particular, we spent a lot of time talking about, you know, missing middle development, you know, everything. We're in this well-established neighborhood. So any type of development would be, you know, a reuse of a building or you know, redevelopment of a property. And so, we spent a lot of time defining what that would look like and how that would fit in with the neighborhood. And so having that be something as part of the consideration in the process, you know, in the approval process of new projects in the neighborhood, I think is one way that neighborhood associations can have a really strong voice and also, you know, ease some of the anxiety that the neighbors have. You know, there was a particular project that you know, was spot zoned and was something completely different than what was within our plan. And so that's what causes a lack of trust and some frustration. And so, you know, I think having real teeth in those plans and a commitment that, you know, once the neighborhood plan is written and the cities agree to it, that we stick with it.
This is Marissa again. I'd agree with that. We have a neighborhood plan from like the early 90s. I think it was written on a typewriter and it's on the website if you want to take a look at it. It was not followed at all. But that's one of the huge trust issues that communities have with the city, is that those take a lot of work and a lot of effort on the part of the neighbors. You have to get a grant from the city, you know, $30,000, $50,000, whatever it is. You have to hire a consultant. You have to go through this whole process. And then most of the time it's not, well, it's not code. It's a guidance. And most of the time it's not reinforced by city council or city or whoever. So anyhow, our neighborhood plan from the 90s, we've been trying to get that. I've been trying to get that redone for several years now. And I bring it up every time we talk about what Energize grant we're going to send in. And my board will not vote for it because they are, you know, fiscally conservative people. And they're like, why would we spend $50,000 of taxpayer money for a plan that the city's not going to care about? And I don't have any argument against that. It's like, well, yeah, you're right, but it'd be really nice to have a new plan so at least we could say they weren't following it. I don't know what the argument is for that, but I think if we could somehow incorporate those neighborhood plans with a little more force, perhaps there's, I don't think they're all that different from each other. I haven't looked at a lot of them. I looked at a couple, but a lot of them seem to have a lot of the same elements. And if at least those things were reinforced in the code, it would help.
So this is Shellen, and this is a question just to educate me. I guess I'm trying to understand what the role of the neighborhood plan is currently in the role of code or not. I mean, like, what is it? Is it like, yeah.
I think it was something, I don't know the history of them. I think, each neighborhood kind of has their own charm. And so I think it probably started out as a way just to reinforce like what makes each neighborhood unique. But when they're not code, they're not enforceable. And even if a development goes against something in a neighborhood plan, it doesn't matter because that's not the law. So they've really, I don't think that they're being maybe implemented as originally intended.
It doesn't sound like they were intended to be implemented.
I don't know the history of them.
Identity. So I guess maybe where I go with it is like, is there a false sense of empowerment through the neighborhood planning process? And is it because it happened in the 90s? Like, I know Kelly's neighborhood is pretty recent.
Ours was in the 90s, but like Northwest, they just did one a couple of years ago. And it was a lot of, it was like $50,000 and months of work for their neighborhood association.
And so that's where I'm going. If you're giving a neighborhood this sense of empowerment, and I think we did it for some homeless housing stuff that's come up recently. And I say we like as a big royal we, but like we give folks the idea that their voice matters and that their neighborhood plan matters and that their testimony matters. But really it's about the law, or really it's about the code. And so it's sort of a false sense of like, I think we should understand what the role is, and the neighborhood should understand what the role of those are very, very clearly, because if they're not code, they're not code.
Right. And I get that for the neighborhood plan. I mean, that's why my board won't, they're like, it's a waste of our time. We don't want to spend money and we don't want to put the effort into something like that. I think there's a difference between the neighborhood plan and testimony though, because
fair enough. I was just making gross generalizations,
but yeah, I think neighborhood plans could be really great. They're just, it's just like a pretty package of what you wish you had, and nobody has to follow it.
Well, I struggle with that because I think that ultimately goes to really creating a distrust of public sector and a distrust of private developers. And that just doesn't really help anyone.
It does. And I've seen, people get up here and present their neighborhood plan, say this doesn't fit anything, and they're just disregarded. And it's sad. I think it's really sad because there was a lot of time and effort put into that, and people do care about it, just like they care about Boise Blueprint. But again, that's not code. So,
and if I could speak to just, I think this is a really great point to pin on that has been a struggle for neighborhood planning recently. But I would say if you look at more modern neighborhood plans, they're not supposed to be an exclusive future land use plan. It is not only a land use plan. The Northwest neighborhood plan has goals around community engagement, around safety, and things outside of just how we control the development process. And same with, I know, the West Downtown neighborhood plan. I think it's easy to point to the land use process as something to be, can I use my control to do this? But it identifies all sorts of different actions that are supposed to be more of a civics self-empowerment of the neighborhood based in placemaking and many other opportunities. But it does get a riff because in the 90s in neighborhood planning, that was very much an effort of planning in the 90s was this kind of local control of it. And it's just evolved. And now the code, it does need to all kind of line up in a way that's effective and transparent.
Yeah, I think this is Marissa, I think the one that stuck out to me the most was like the Ustick. I don't think it's the Ustick Neighborhood Association, but it's like the little historic district in Ustick. And there was something that was approved there that just was not, according to their neighborhood plan, like that should never have happened. But, and they worked really hard on trying to show the importance of their plan, but it wasn't code. So it met the code.
Yeah, and this is a really good conversation. As Deanna had mentioned, neighborhood plans have evolved. So when they first started, it was a group of neighbors that got together and they wrote it themselves. And oftentimes those were efforts so that they could thwart off development that might happen in their area or preclude what could be included in their neighborhood or along their corridors. And then over time, they've gotten more standardized. So as you read the much newer ones, you will see similarities. You'll see some of those self-empowering things that, it encourages them to get a neighborhood group to talk about traffic safety and what they can do, making sure that they have volunteers that they can do all of those things. But it's something that we need to talk about in the city as far as neighborhood planning goes. But when we talk about module 3, we need to talk about, what role will the neighborhoods have? That do neighborhood associations have, X amount of minutes to talk at public hearings? How does noticing happen? Is the city putting onus on a neighborhood association to disseminate information that, not all neighborhood associations do it the same? Not all neighborhood have the reach that they need. As Esther said, not all neighborhoods have, a full list of individuals that live there. Not always are those people that are on the list representative of the people that actually live and recreate and work in those areas. So we just need to figure out exactly, who's reviewing those applications, what that process looks like, what the checklist looks like, who can appeal, and really how people are participating in the process. What types of notification are appropriate as we move through to make sure that people feel involved, that we haven't given them a false sense of because you don't like something, we can't vote on that. We have the actual code that we have to rely on heavily. And so that checklist that we're talking about becomes even more important. So all of these things are really, you start to see how they all tie together and how some of them overflow into other areas, but this is important stuff. So this is really good conversation. Ian?
This is Ian, and I think Andrew started to hit on something there, is the process of, neighbor notifications and applications and rezones and CUPs. Is that a way to start tying in, neighborhood associations? We just did one for a project, and I didn't read every single address, but I don't know that the neighborhood association was listed on the address list, but we reached out to them as well because we figured it'd be, in good faith. That being said, I don't think they showed up. I think we had 3 people total show up for this particular project. So, I wonder if that is maybe something we can look at as the noticing process without creating another step, another thing that we then have to go through for an application.
Yeah, this is Marissa again. We get notice of everything. We're within city and county, so we get notice of everything that's in our boundary. We don't post everything. Like we're not going to put, this neighbor wants to put an ADU or a shop, or we don't care about that stuff. It's only things that might have a much bigger effect on the community. And keep in mind, like SWACA is something like 12 square miles. It's enormous. And there's some neighborhood associations that are just a couple of blocks. So everybody in that NA might already be getting noticed just because they're within the boundary. But I appreciate what's going on. I know every year when the roadside produce stand gets his license renewed, I don't know. Some of it's a little weird, but it's helpful.
This is Drew on this topic of neighborhoods. I think that maybe, to me, the area to empower a neighborhood association is how they shape Blueprint Boise. Blueprint is already divided now into, in often cases, broader geographic areas that it's not neighborhood specific, but there's a sense of empowerment there if the work that the neighborhood is doing is folded into Blueprint in a way, because Blueprint is often referenced for some of these bigger applications that require these bigger approvals. I don't know the extent to which that has happened in the past, but I've spent a fair amount of time on neighborhood associations, and empowerment is something that you have to be careful of. Neighborhood associations, we try to distance ourselves from being any type of enforcement authority or decision-making authority. I mean, we don't have directors and officers insurance, for example, and you put yourself at risk when you empower yourself too much. So I think Blueprint creates a really good mechanism to fold in the energy these neighborhood associations often bring.
And Kelly, you've been so patient online. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. So, and I'm going to go back to the neighborhood association plan. I know we kind of went away from that a little bit, but like our plan, we did implement it within, I think it was actually signed off like in 2 years ago. We worked on it 3 years ago. And, I mean, we were looking at Blueprint Boise and the zoning and all of those sort of things when we were, that's all incorporated in the plan. And so, I guess when I say, there's having teeth in the plan is like, we came up with, definitions and some desires as far as land use and reuse and redevelopment and so forth. And, I mean, if the code is written and there's limited ways in which we can have input on a project, if it's all within code and that's the one thing, that's the one avenue then we have, well, then let it, then we need to stick with that. If there really is this, if there really is going to be no benefit of doing a neighborhood plan, then Marissa does have a good point. What's the point of doing it? So there was a lot of effort put in there. It wasn't, I don't think, we were overstepping the bounds or trying to dictate, the types of, trying to exclude development or so forth, or doing anything above and beyond what Blueprint Boise and the code already did. We just took that and said, okay, this is how we would like to see this manifest in our neighborhood. And so that's what I mean with, having that be part of the consideration when the staff is evaluating and approving a project. Does it fit in with, these?
Kelly, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, okay. We lost your last thought there.
Oh, okay.
Cut out.
I'm sure it was absolutely brilliant. So
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. So I don't know where you dropped off, but that's what, but yeah, the point I just wanted to make is that, I know that some of the plans, there's a longer history, it's evolved in the purpose, but, the plan that our neighborhood put in, and I know the newer ones, we were considering Blueprint Boise and zoning code and, and expressed our desires based off of, what fit in with that and what we felt fit with the neighborhood. And so when the staff, if there's a staff approval, if that's the process, if a project fits in with the code, have that be considered as well, so that we have things that adhere, meet with what the neighborhood also expressed, saying this is what we would like to see. Hopefully you got all that.
We got you that time.
Okay.
This is Tim. I wanted to mention a couple things, and I attended 2 of the 3 recent public meetings on the zoning rewrite and expressed this at each of those. The ordinance that we have in Boise right now started in 1966, and at a very different time in the city's history and this country's history as it relates to how cities were developing. So we can rest assured that the idea was that we would separate all the land uses and we'd build highways and everybody would drive to do everything. That's what inspired the ordinance we have. So, 60 years later, the point of this process is absolutely not to figure out how we can organize our arguments. That is not the purpose of the zoning rewrite, I can guarantee you. It is to figure out how the city should grow and then make that as easy as we possibly can. And so the goals that we've been stating are meaningful to us. And in these public sessions, we were going through not just what the goal is, but what does that mean? And how do we then as a community, the success of this will have much to do with this module 3. and the degree to which we can shift from the kind of stalemate that we've been within for quite some time, as the idea behind the current ordinance, this idea we just separate everything and drive to do everything. Once everybody realized that's complete community breakdown, we get into this stalemate where everybody's trying to stop things from happening because there isn't a path forward that seems to be a positive one. Well, the point of this process is to say, what's that positive path? And then let's clear it for people so that we can become the city that is the best version of Boise that we can be. So I just want to make sure everybody understands we recognize that, and going into module 3 with these goals, that's what we're seeking to do. Not make sure that we've got processes that we can argue within, but how do we actually make these things as simple as we can to achieve. The second thing I'll mention is that as we're discussing neighborhood plans, I have to mention that, you know, the discussion that we're having around frustration related to neighborhood plans, whether it's a neighborhood thinking that, hey, we didn't follow the plan, or it's this awkwardness of the expectations that come out of a neighborhood plan are just completely off. All those kinds of things are discussions that happen in every city. And it has to do with the planning practice being broken to a large degree. So we have thoughts about this and have a new group that Deanna's leading within planning that's building up. We're going to have a lot of thoughts about how do we actually plan as a city beyond the ordinance? How do we actually involve people in meaningful ways where the expectations should be clear, and we're doing the things that planning should be doing, and we're not doing the things that planning shouldn't be doing? Because there's lots of times where neighborhood plans become almost like laundry lists of ideas or things people want. That's not helpful, because now you're expecting people to go back to this list and say, have we checked out off each of these things? No community can do that. So we've got to get very precise about what's the value of neighborhood planning in the context of the comprehensive plan, and how we involve the community in that scale of work. So my 2 points on this discussion we've been having. So I just want you to know that the planning department is really acting now on how do we do the planning part better too.
This is Shellen, and that's really helpful. And I think, like, when I hear that, I think, well, so my question is, does module 3 incorporate or not neighborhood plans, knowing that at this moment in time, that neighborhood plans are all over the board and had all sorts of different expectations in the last 40 years as to what their meanings were?
Well, the way the neighborhood plans are incorporated now is they're put within the comprehensive plan. So as an individual rezoning might come up, you would refer to the comprehensive plan or a neighborhood plan if there is one, as it relates to whatever the recommendation is on that rezoning. So that's the way it works now. So we were not anticipating that anything in the zoning code rewrite would change that.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. I guess I wanted to confirm or clarify that. And then, like, another point, I don't know that everyone on the committee knows, but probably most of you do, but I think it's worth saying is part of the process now is for certain things, and most all the projects that I've been involved with, the neighborhood association, and I don't know if it has to be like the president, VP, or I don't know if it has to be the board of the neighborhood or not, but they have what I would call, it's almost a rebuttal period in a public hearing to the developer. And that's not something that I see in a lot of communities in that same way. And with the current code, it sets up the neighborhood and the project to be against each other, I think, in how that is done as a process. And so I guess I'd like to understand if that's purposeful, or if that's still necessary, or if there's a better way, and if that can be outlined in module 3, because it seems like that person who gets to speak for the neighborhood gets this really tremendous voice for the neighborhood that may not be real. So yeah, I don't know. That's, I guess, just a diatribe. But
so Shellen, are you talking about once the application has been submitted for the project and then the neighborhood is notified, the chance to like do written comments and so forth prior to the neighborhood meeting? Is that what you're talking about by a rebuttal period?
No, and the rebuttal period is my words. I mean, that's not like in the code, I don't think. It's when it certainly happens at a CUP. I don't know if it doesn't happen at DR. It does happen at DR, where the applicant, and so usually that's the architect, the developer, the owner, whatever, goes and like does their thing. And then the neighborhood association, I'm looking at Deanna to say, like, am I right on this? The neighborhood association then gets 5 minutes or 8 minutes, 20 minutes.
Oh, you're talking about the action
time.
here. Okay.
To respond to the developer, which is not a bad thing, as much as that person gets a stage in front of the decision makers with no risk. They have no money at risk. They have no property at risk. I mean, there is a good chance, like, to me, the neighbor, the person that's adjacent, should have a 20 minutes. If someone's gonna have 20 minutes, it should be the person that has the risk. And that said, like, you know, a very conservative minded person, I get it, but like, so that idea has always been really hard for me to understand. So that's what I was talking about, Kelly.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to be clear. Yeah.
This is Byron again. So I think one of the kind of guiding goals that we had at the beginning of this process that I wanted to kind of reintroduce again was this notion of predictability. You know, when the code is well worked, and we certainly have worked module 1 and module 2 quite a lot. As we go into module 3, the process for approval, specifically for allowed uses and other non-controversial projects, this issue of predictability really kind of overlaps so much of what we're talking about with the role of neighborhood associations. And there is kind of a natural tension between the predictability of a well-oiled zoning code that allows for projects to be approved in this streamlined process and the kind of local control or other special interest group involvement that we hear from some neighbors. So I wanted to kind of reintroduce that notion of predictability, specifically as we go into module 3, because that was a big goal from the very beginning. And so as we're talking about the regular approval process for allowed use projects, and as we're increasing the number and types specifically of residential housing types that are now under allowed use, I see that as a huge opportunity for us to, again, address affordability, but also address some of the housing justice issues that the city has never really come to terms with as well, and really kind of setting the expectation of what the role of a neighborhood association is moving forward into public hearings.
Hi, this is Jessica. I'm on DR and I want to respond with regards to at least my opinion for the neighborhood association and what I've experienced at DR. They don't always send a representative, and it's made very clear that a representative is announced and they say, I'm so-and-so and I'm a representative for the association. And I think it's great when they do come and speak. A lot of times they have really valid points, and sometimes not so much. We've had a couple associations or folks representing the association say, we don't want it here. We don't care what it looks like. We don't want it. And this goes back to the trust issue.
as an appointed member of DR and knowing my colleagues on that board, I have trust and confidence in that group, specifically, that we can kind of see through that. Hey, I don't want it here. We don't care what it looks like. We see through that. And just because they say that, we know better, if you will. It's probably not the right way to say it, that's not a legitimate reason to deny a project. So I think, and again, it's a trust issue. We need to trust folks that have been appointed or elected to these boards to do their roles and responsibilities, understand the code, understand what they can approve and deny, or deny, or possibly not even make a decision on because it's not in their authority. The associations need to have a voice. And I'm not saying that they should have some power or authority per se, legal authority, but they need to have a voice. And I think most often they just want to be heard. And a lot of times they come into some meetings and like, we know what the decision's going to be, but we want to make our statement and have it on the record that we don't agree with what we think the outcome's going to be. And so I think it's important that they continue to be involved and continue to have a voice at the public setting, at the public hearing setting.
Thank you, Jessica. Patrick, you have your hand raised as well.
Yes, thank you. I just want to, I know this is unlikely, but I want to go on the record and say it, it's ironic in a way, that we could do more stuff in writing. These meetings are very, very, very long. And if some things could be done in writing by various parties, the meetings could be shorter for all involved while still achieving communication goals.
And there's a couple comments in the chat. Esther said the city, this is just from a little while ago too, the city does provide notices to neighborhood associations. The CNA sends out a monthly P&Z notice to residents that are on the CNA P&Z list. The email includes the project, date of meeting, and a summary of the proposal. And I know every neighborhood association acts differently on how they disseminate some of that information, or if they have a separate P&Z kind of committee as well. And then Hillary also commented, yes, agree with Byron. Addressing this tension is key for module 3. Oh, and Kelly has her hand raised again. Go for it, Kelly.
Hi. Yeah. Well, since I'm one of the few neighborhood association people here, those the rest of you speak up. But I think it is important. I mean, for the associations to, have to be able to participate in the hearings and have a voice. I do agree that there does need to be some education that occurs. I mean, our neighborhood, we have to remind people that, this is what the zoning law says and this is what is allowed because, Shallon, I think you do bring up a good point is that it does kind of give this sense of it's a hearing. So if I go in and complain loud enough, I may be able to change the results. Well, if the law is the law and it says that they can build it, well, then it can be built, right? So I think there needs to be some education and that's one of the things in our collaborative visioning meeting with the neighborhood leadership is, as part of module 3 is having a summit and talking about, how can we educate the neighborhood associations and how can they be actively engaged and provide feedback that's meaningful and help the people in the neighborhoods understand, maybe what some of the limitations are or what's allowed or, how to kind of diffuse some of the hard feelings that happens because of that. But I do think that the neighborhood associations, I mean, some are more engaged, more savvy, have been around longer. They understand the process better. The way they approach the hearings are different. Some maybe are newer and they're just coming up to speed. And so maybe that's why, they may need to spend some time, understanding better how things work with planning and zoning and what the overall process is. And so I think that there can be some we can come up with some processes or maybe like annual training sessions or something with the associations to help clarify that, so that we can at least help alleviate some of the anxiety just over the fact of, well, I don't like it, I don't want you to build it, that sort of conversation. So instead of having that conversation, we can have, well, this is what the code says, so what makes sense, how can we compromise, or how can we address some of the concerns that the neighborhood may have.
Hi, this is Roberta. We've had a lot of discussion about neighborhood associations today and probably in the past. I don't know if you, being the city folks in attendance, what's the status of reevaluating Energize and the neighborhood association? Because I did see Tiffany speak at city council, and is there a way that a lot of what's been brought up here could be incorporated into some of that discussion to benefit the neighborhood associations and et cetera? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Roberta. This is Lindsay. So Tiffany, for those of you that don't know, Energize moved into the Office of Community Engagement, which is the office that I'm in. It used to live in PDS, but it's more of a community engagement department, I guess I should say. And so she has been doing a lot of outreach over the last couple months with Energize on kind of rethinking, what are the priorities? What should Energize look like? Where should resources go? And Tiffany's a part of this process as well. She's on vacation right now, and we'll connect when she comes back. But I believe her timeline is to give recommendations in the fall. And some of that aligns with, our conversations as well in some of this. So these will be together for sure. So that's something that we're working through on what she hears from neighborhood associations, leadership, and, everyone involved.
And just to clarify for folks who might listen to this, the neighborhood associations and the Energize are intertwined.
Yes, exactly. And then there's different funding, and like Marissa mentioned, the neighborhood investments that go throughout the city, neighborhood plans, all those kind of interconnect, and very intertwined.
So I know we are kind of getting to time to sort of segue to thinking about kind of the outreach process for module 3, and just kind of thinking about all of the comments that we've heard. As you mentioned, Roberta, a lot of stuff has come up about neighborhood associations, and I think you all have made a lot of really good points. This is Lena, by the way. Sorry, I forgot to say that. And, like Shellen, the point that you brought up about, thinking about who really carries the risk in a decision-making process, and thinking about that comes back to a lot of things that are important in module 3, which is thinking about impacts and thinking about risk, and also sort of the legal aspect of the process. And I think that one of the challenges that we have with development and with zoning is that, the entire process comes back to being essentially based around the development of private property, right? Is one of the core tenets of it. And so we run into, it can be difficult sometimes because it's one of the most open processes that we have for people to participate in, but ultimately it's coming back to those legal ramifications around, private property. Sometimes it's a kind of a feedback that we hear from folks that we struggle with. If people say like, well, why should a renter have a voice in what happens here? Because they don't have the financial risk in this neighborhood. They don't own a home, which of course our response would be that we all live here and we all have to have we should all have a voice. And that, really what it comes back to is that one of the key things that people seem to have a lot of concerns about, whether it's density or parking, all this feedback we get during the zoning code, is really thinking about how we are stewards of our shared resources and how those can be, there's the sort of personal risk of private development, and then there's the sort of the shared impacts of how everything influences the space that we all live in together, whether it's our water or our roads. And so this has been a really good discussion, I think, to start thinking about, and this is going to be key as we think about how we do this outreach and how we kind of engage with our community on this, is really starting to tease those things out and understand both the pragmatics of it, but also rather than just saying, well, that means that, people shouldn't participate or something like that, or that voices shouldn't be heard, but really thinking critically about how do we frame these discussions so that impact is, their input is meaningful and is impactful, but is also not being perhaps misdirected into areas where at the end of the day, you're looking at a legal decision and that's how it has to be made. So just want to thank you all for your comments on that.
This is Shellen again, and you brought up a good point, and I think one that we talked about a while ago in this committee, which is, I think it was this committee, the appeal process, and if it stays with who it goes to when it's appealed. And someone was giving the example of an appeal committee that's not council. You know, in my brain, usually an appeal goes to council. So it doesn't always, but and I think it is really important for appeals to be managed in such a way that not everybody can always appeal, in the sense of like, if it's just $50 and it doesn't cost anyone anything to appeal, it ends up costing taxpayers a lot of money to appeal projects if there is no basis for appeal. So that needs, I think that cost benefit sort of needs to be like, I mean, at least analyzed to the extent that you can create an appeal process that is like a little more balanced. And then I also think that that appeal committee needs to have somebody who understands the law, right? So that we're not setting our politicians up for litigation, unnecessary litigation, because there's a room full of lovers or haters. It's usually haters. Right. And it's hard for anyone to face their voters to say, oh, you know, I can't do what this whole room full of people is telling me to do, because we will get sued and it will cost all of us a lot of money, time, and effort. And so I guess I'd like to see a way in which that can be sort of created in the appeal process. And it's not to say that our politicians shouldn't be involved, because they should be accountable to the voters, but it seems like there needs to be, you know, a real legal analysis of appeals at some level. And I know you have a city attorney who probably reviews stuff, but that kind of happens in the background, as I understand it now, and the public might not be might not fully understand how that happens. I don't know if that made sense.
It falls very well within many of the discussions that we've had of throwing different ideas out there and how we can achieve the best process, and evaluating that, as Tim had noted, that we have a very old process and it doesn't achieve what we're looking for today. So like, what would an ideal process look like? And so we've talked about a number of these things. So it's good to hear this, you know, you guys think about some of those things as well.
Yeah, I guess I don't think that our city council should be the end all be all on maintaining our code and law. I think our city council should be charged with running a government and running our city. But that's not just code. Like, code should speak for itself.
And just to confirm, you have to be a party of record. On the record, you are the only folks that can file an appeal for an item, correct? So if I didn't write a letter or attend a hearing and I just read it after the fact, I can't file an appeal if I didn't agree with the outcome. You have to be on the record, correct?
Appeals through the public, well, so if there's a public hearing decision, an appeal would be a party of record. An administrative decision can be appealed by anybody as long as it's filed in a timely manner. So they're looked at a little bit differently as they move forward through the process.
And then what's considered a party of record? Just somebody
Anybody
who shows up
that
at a meeting.
has participated, so they would be on the sign-in sheet. They provided written correspondence or they provided verbal testimony. So
Yeah,
those
so I
would
think
be parties of record.
Yeah, and we've talked about this a whole bunch, but the folks that have the time and the money to show up are not representative of the folks in our community.
Yeah, and Hillary had a comment as well. Hillary?
Yeah, I mean, just from a more, typically what we like to see on an appeal process from the legal perspective, and when we think about it in terms of appeals of cases and things like that, in the normal, in the typical legal process, you want to have at every stage some items that are closed substantively. The things that it's not just every appeal isn't a new bite at the apple where everything can be challenged again, right? Like as you go up the appeal process, those issues that are in dispute should narrow at every stage. Again, like to what Shellen said, like you shouldn't end up at city council with everything subject to the same exact arguments that have been vetted 3 times, right? So that's, I mean, it's for efficiency, but it's also for certainty in that process and certainty in the outcome. And it also has the effect of letting the public know, like at what point you need to get your objections in, and at what point a decision is made and everybody moves on from that. To Shellen's point at the very, very beginning of all of this, at some point you have to make a decision and move on from that decision. And it's not going to make everybody happy. There's no way this process is going to make everybody happy, but that ability to appeal should narrow at every level.
And we have had a lengthy discussion about that as well. Really talking about should new information be allowed to be submitted as you move forward? Is it a new hearing each time, or does that narrow as you move forward? And all information needs to be submitted in a timely way so it can be considered at each level. So, all of these are very, very good and very close to, where we have been talking. Esther?
So just a couple of thoughts. This is Esther. My thoughts are regarding the conversation of public involvement and then, public involvement. So I'm a huge, huge proponent of public involvement and the ability for community members to participate in a process. I strongly believe, even if I didn't sit on a neighborhood association board, that there is a role for neighborhood associations in the hearing process when proposals are made in their areas. However, I think there are opportunities to maybe define what is allowed versus what would be where an association has 20 minutes versus not. So, how do we get residents to be okay with allowed uses? So we just need to make sure we get those allowed uses right and say, and this, I'm just throwing this out. I still need to think more about it, but I want to share it with folks. Allowed uses in a neighborhood, maybe those all go through administrative. It's conditional uses that would go through a hearing process. I think someone today mentioned, oh gosh, was it you, Drew, or was it you, Ian? We've got those opportunities, like if folks meet certain sustainability or affordability components, then there's an opportunity for them to build a taller building or do some other things. We need a clear picture of what that looks like, but just something to think about on that end. And then on the outreach efforts, what I would say is the first round of outreach efforts where staff went around to different areas of the city. I heard great feedback on that. And as a matter of fact, at one of our little information gathering meetings that we held in our neighborhood this week, one of the comments, because we asked for input on all things, transportation, zoning, shelters, all that. One of the comments that was made was that it was exciting to see that the city wants humans to participate in this process. And, I want to recognize or acknowledge the city staff in particular, having been involved in city activities as a resident of this community for the last decade. This is the most robust outreach efforts I have seen come out of City Hall. So, as we start talking about, okay, what is this outreach going to look like, or what do we want it to look like? I would say this last version of outreach where there were only 3 meetings, not suitable. Let's go back and let's look at what was done that first round and consider something very similar. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. And that's a good segue to the last portion of our conversation. So in October and a little bit into November will be kind of our last big push into the community. Not only will it be module 3, but it'll be the consolidated draft. So at that point, it'll be several hundred pages that were headed out to the community before it'll kind of go for submittal to P&Z and then to City Council. So Esther's thoughts were great. She liked the last round going more neighborhood focused. Also thoughts about format. The last round that we did was kind of more open house that we heard from Roberta. Then we had a presentation, Q&A, and then we also brought in, we probably had 8 to 10 planners at each of those meetings as well, so we could spread out. And there wasn't as much pressure just on these 3 planners and Jessica and Tim as well to answer some of the questions, because a lot of people have a lot of questions and we pretty much stayed very late every night at all of these meetings. So it definitely helps having more staff there as well. So open to thoughts, best practices you've seen elsewhere, also ways of hearing about the meetings, forms of communication that you want to hear about it. So open to all those. I'll let anybody take the floor. I see a lot of you shaking your heads like you have ideas.
Brad, we heard that you wanted us to get the word out. Do you have any suggestions on how we do that? So in the past, we've done, press releases, we've been on the news, the radio. Do you think any of those were effective, or?
I would say probably the news would be, or these public broadcast deals. As a homeowner, I've always thought that, I was always on the side that the homeowner probably had more input or had more to lose. I'm kind of changed thought on that. And believe that the renters probably have a lot more to say these days. There's a good chance that the percentage of renters in Boise are higher than what they used to be, for sure. And I don't believe that renters necessarily want to rent. So they're being forced into it at this point because of affordability and all that. And so maybe some way of getting flyers out to these big apartment complexes to cover a big mass of, the density. Yeah, I mean, I think the renters need to have involvement in this because, not everybody wants to rent. I'm rambling now, so thanks.
This is Ian. I think that was a great point. Whether or not that's trying to get to some of the bigger apartment complexes and actually have meetings or hearings, or not hearings is the wrong word, meetings with people of that community. I think that's good. I rented when I first moved here and I went to one of those meetings. It was very informative, very helpful. I also think having a diverse range of ways to reach out to the community is good. Not just having, those open house kind of QA sessions. I think those were effective. But to Esther's point, having ones that are, in each, community as well, each parts of the neighborhood. So a little bit of everything. I know that's not, it's not the golden ticket or anything like that, but I think anything is better than nothing. So.
This is Byron again. I agree with Ian and Esther. I think geographic variation with the meetings, the open house was really great. The folks that I was able to push into some of those meetings, the pitch that I had was that you can have one-on-one time with a planner and the decision makers and the people that are working on the code behind the scenes. So I think that's a huge draw for people. It also, I think, at least the last 3 with the open house format seemed to keep everybody's attention really well. It was a more concise presentation. The visuals were awesome. And then people dispersed and did what they naturally want to do, which is kind of talk one-on-one with people afterwards. So.
I know I've reached out to folks on the city staff and thank you for all that's been happening. But I've also reached out to some people in the group here, and all of us have our own little bubbles of who we talk to. And I think in part, it's our responsibility to reach out to them and help them know what's going on, or invite somebody from the city staff or someone we work with here to help get the word out.
So this is Shellen, and I think I think outreach is great. I think I'm looking at the timeline on the website, and it says that the fall is this consolidated draft module, and then the public hearings start in winter of 23, so January through March or whatever. But like practically speaking, you're not considering the outreach that you're asking about today is not public hearings. It is module 3 starting now.
Yep.
Starting now till when?
So we'll do our outreach period October through right before the holidays is kind of the timeline, because staff still needs time to make edits really over the holidays for us to then submit by February, I believe is our timeline.
So I guess with that said, thank you. That was just clarifying for me. I think it's really important for you all to have measurable goals in regards to outreach, and reasonable and measurable goals, so that you know when you can stop and go forward to make that decision, right, to draw that line. And I also think, and I didn't have the opportunity because I was traveling a bunch this summer to go to these open houses. But I think we need to constantly be telling each other and and the community, like how many opportunities they have had, how many people have spoken, how many groups you guys have seen, and make those into graphics. I mean, you guys are great at graphics, right? Like there's only so many people that are ever going to care. And the amount of effort that you have to get that secondary or like tertiary bubble, it's just not going to be worth it for us as like taxpayers. I mean, it's like at some point you meet your goal and you move. And I guess that goes back to my like rapid decision making, but I would just really like to see a way that it can be public outreach in these different ways to these different entities, this many people, and stop and move. And tell folks how much you've done. Like we've been doing this for years. It's like thousands of hours of staff time. Like, what is that number? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of, that's a tremendous number. And like, that should be on a graph. So when people say, this is the first time I'm hearing about it, it's like, I'm really sorry. But we've done, $14 million worth of outreach. That was, I just made that.
Just
go for it,
super quick.
Roberta.
This is Roberta, and there is a list which I've shared with people of the groups and the organizations that the city has reached out to. And Brad, if you haven't seen it lately, I mean, it's worth everyone to revisit it for exactly Shellen's point. There's been a lot of outreach, getting people to respond and actually engage. That is a personal responsibility. So
thanks, Roberta. And then Esther had a comment online, and she also has her hand raised, said, consider setting up a booth at City Hall during First Thursday. Postcards are good. I think the laundry mat outreach is great. Esther, did you have more to add to that?
I do, to Shellen's comment. So I bring a different perspective to the table as a first generation Mexican American, and having grown up low income, I can tell you that it's not that people don't care. We are all at different levels on the Maslow hierarchy of needs. There are people struggling who may care, but do not have the capacity or the resource to make one of our meetings. When I think of some of our underserved populations in our community, there is a language barrier. There's a cultural barrier. So I understand that, there's only so much outreach that we can do, but I think we also have to understand the makeup of some of our community members. And for myself, who is, who has the privilege of working a 9-to-5 job and has the privilege of spending my volunteer time doing whatever I want, including going to evening meetings. Not everybody has that. And there are people who need to be at the table because they would be directly, maybe more directly impacted than I. So that's just something I would like us to keep in mind as we think about outreach and engagement.
Thank you, Esther.
This is Shellen. I think the point's really well taken, and I think that should be in your measurable goals.
And before we close, Brad, you want to go really quickly?
Yeah, sorry. Just a broad comment here, but we're making these decisions in a very unique time in history. We've had COVID, we've had the mass migration, we've had open borders, we've had war, we've got all kinds of influences towards why we don't have affordable housing anymore, why there's so many people here. The term affordable housing, I mean, that's like it needs to go in the dictionary now because it's like a new thing. But we're making some big decisions on, history changes. So we don't want to jump into this big change without thought. And because things are going to change again, it's going to slow down. We're already seeing the economy change. We're seeing affordability starting to lower, housing starting to lower. I'm just saying we need to be careful on how we look at the future and not be too quick. I understand how much money we're spending on this process, but we need to be careful on what we do because we can't take some of it back.
All right, we do have 4 individuals that are attendees. Gary has his hand up, so I think we'd like to hear from Gary. Can you release? Gary, would you like to visit with us?
Sure, I have just some short comments, keeping in mind Tim's comment about finding the positive path and making things simple to achieve. I thought those are really important kind of principles here to operate on, and they kind of, I built my comments on them. So one thing that I really liked was that neighborhood association meeting where all the associations were invited to participate in a noontime call. I think it lasted an hour. I thought that was a great way to reach out to the neighborhood associations, and at least one way to do it. And I got some good feedback, I thought, from at least one of the members on our neighborhood association that attended that. So one of the other things is that I think the city needs to impose some, talking about the process that the city is going through to accomplish these things, is the city needs to impose some standards on itself in terms of processing times and those kinds of things, and then living with those. Time is money. I know I sit on a committee for one of the local nonprofit development companies, and so we're experiencing a lot of lost opportunity costs as a result of the delays with the city. And we're going to detail this in a communication with the city, but one of the other things is, I think, is accelerating the processing for affordable housing projects is really important to a consideration, and then living with that. I'm an area director on the Southeast Neighborhood Association, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but I think that there's a real issue around the BSU campus. I think there needs to be some special attention on the part of the city and in cooperation with BSU and back and forth. I think it's what has happened there. And I don't completely understand the history, but there's a kind of a vacuum or a breach or something that SENA has kind of stepped into, Southeast Neighborhood Association has stepped into. And I think they're exercising some judgments on things that go beyond what the scope of a neighborhood association should ever be asked to do, or frankly, in my opinion, allowed to do. And I think that some of the things that are happening are resulting in some bad planning decisions. And I think some of the things that SENA is doing kind of ignores some of the needs of Boise State University. And when the planning that they had done, 7 years ago or whatever, I don't think it could account for the kinds of issues that they're having to deal with today. And so I really would like to echo some of the things that Kelly, Drew, Shell, and Roberta said. While I think the neighborhood associations need to have a voice, I think there needs to be some, moderation in it, and maybe moderating it through turning the volume down, at least this neighborhood association, on some of those issues, through training and maybe a different kind of relationship and information exchange with the city of Boise. So that was it. Thanks.
And Chris, would you like to visit with us?
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, just a couple quick comments. I won't reiterate a few points. I mean, I'll just say I think a lot of people. So first of all, my name is Chris Runyon. I live in the East End, trying to get familiar with the new code, trying to just get a picture in my head of really what it means. And I don't know if I'd say I have concerns, but I definitely have questions about what density is, what the reduced parking is, what the additional heights, building heights would look like. So I won't go into that because you guys have already heard that. But some of the other things is, I think this idea of density and affordability correlating, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think density in some areas, you may get affordable housing. In other areas, you may get just expensive housing, right? It's based on the property value where you do the development. So I would encourage everyone to really think about how they use that term. Density doesn't always equate to affordability. It depends on the property value. So where I live, I would assume density would look like, more 3-story narrow homes, not, 2-level below median income homes. So I just want to make that point. And that leads me into, I have concerns with the incentives, specifically the affordability one. I think most people would equate affordability with maybe like workforce housing. And the way that it's set up right now, it's for a property that is sold. So if I were to develop a 5-unit complex, I have to sell one at 120% of median income. And I calculate that around $115,000 for a household of 4. So that is the definition of affordable that's in the code right now. And when I back that out to what the home purchase would be, I get at a 5% interest rate, I get $450,000. So I don't know. I really encourage you guys to look at either changing that word or changing the median income, because I think most people are going to think about someone making less than $115,000. And really the only other thing is with the outreach, I think it really comes down to visuals and giving people a way to, it's needs to be open, transparent, and understandable. I think Esther, someone made the comment. I mean, this code is extremely complicated, and I think you guys are doing a good job of describing the vision, but how that vision actually is going to play out in actuality needs to maybe be worked on a little bit. So if possible, if the city could come up with more pictures of what type of housing is going to be built in these smaller type lots, what a tiny home looks like, and what a cottage village looks like. Those types of things, I think, are what are causing a lot of concern. And if possible, for this next round to get outreach, making sure if the city can provide something to say the neighborhood associations, that they can then dispel out, because like someone mentioned, that the neighborhood association members, which I am a member of the ENA board, definitely not speaking for the board by any means right now, but a lot of people don't have the time to dig into this. So if you had stuff that you could give them and then disseminate out, I think that would be really helpful. And I think they do play an important part, especially when we've talked about how difficult it is to get involvement. But in the same hand, I hear people talking about we want to reduce the involvement of the neighborhood association. So I think those things need to be kept in balance and thought of that one affects the other. So, but I appreciate this meeting and your time and ability to make a few comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody else before we close out?
On Zillow, houses in Boise under 450,000 or less that have 3 bedrooms for a family of 4 per se, there's 10 on the market according to Zillow. There's probably more, but I think that's like a good 120%, 115,000, it seems like a lot of money, and $450,000 is a lot more than I could afford right now. But the market right now is crazy. AMIs adjust based on market. So you have to have a code that is not based on price, is based on AMI. Like, you sort of have to do that. So it is an interesting time. But I just wanted to.
Yeah, and I'll just mention with that, I think because we're going to allow a developer to do additional units, say 5 that, may cause impacts to neighbors, the trade-off is that developer is going to provide, quote, affordable housing. And my point is I'm trying to make the point that if we're going to say that, as a neighbor personally, I would be more okay with that if you provided workforce. So 80% a median that someone could purchase that home for, not 120. I just don't think we need to help subsidize 120% a median, because that's less than half of the people in Boise make that. So I think we should really focus on that lower half. Those are the ones that are probably going to have more difficulty.
Last call for any of our attendees that would like to chat. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and close out the Citywide Advisory Committee meeting for August 25th, and then we'll be back in September on Thursday, September 29th. So we look forward to seeing everybody. Thank you.